This is the story of a man abandoned by his own family the moment he had nothing left to offer. No money, no status, no use to them. Left to rebuild his life alone. He claws his way from rock bottom to extraordinary success through sheer will, while the family that discarded him goes on with their lives, never looking back. Years later, when word spreads of his transformation, the same relatives who vanished during his darkest hour resurface, smiling, affectionate, and suddenly very interested in reconnecting. But some doors, once closed by betrayal, don't open the same way twice. The car in the driveway was new, expensive, the kind of vehicle that announced itself before anyone stepped out of it. Daniel watched from his study window as his sister emerged first, adjusting her sunglasses, followed by his uncle and, a moment later, his mother. Older now, her hair a different shade than he remembered, her smile already arranged for the cameras that weren't there. They hadn't called. They hadn't written. 7 years of silence. And now they stood on his porch like tourists arriving at a landmark. Cameras poised for a reunion no one had actually earned. He didn't move at first. He let the doorbell ring twice, 3 times, let them shift their weight on the steps and glance at each other with the particular discomfort of people unaccustomed to waiting. Through the window he studied his mother's face, searching for some flicker of the shame she should have carried for 7 years. He found none, only anticipation, only the practiced warmth of people who believed enough time had passed to erase what they'd done. He thought of the nights he'd slept in his car, the calls that went unanswered, the silence that had taught him more about his family than 28 years of holidays ever had. Daniel opened the door slowly, his expression calm, unreadable, giving away nothing. "Well," he said quietly, "look who remembered my address." 10 years earlier, Sunday dinners at his parents' house had felt like something solid, something permanent. Daniel would arrive with wine his father approved of and stories from the firm that made his uncle lean forward with interest, and for a few hours each week he believed he belonged somewhere unconditionally. Back then he was the golden nephew, the promising son, a junior partner on track to make senior before 30. His mother introduced him at parties with visible pride, looping her arm through his like a trophy she'd personally polished. His sister borrowed money without hesitation, always certain he'd say yes, and he always did, because that was what family meant, or so he'd believed. His uncle, a man who measured worth in numbers and net gains, invited him to golf outings with clients, treating him less like a nephew and more like an asset worth cultivating. Daniel mistook the attention for love. He didn't yet understand the difference between being valued and being useful, a distinction that would cost him everything when the two finally split apart. There had been warmth, or something that resembled it closely enough to fool him. Birthday dinners, congratulatory calls when he closed a major deal, his father's hand on his shoulder, heavy with approval, at a milestone that made the family name look good by association. He hadn't questioned any of it. Why would he? The house was full most Sundays, the wine was always good, and no one had yet shown him what remained of that warmth once the money stopped flowing and the names stopped opening doors. He would learn soon enough. Life has a particular cruelty reserved for people who mistake convenience for love. The collapse came in stages the way most disasters do, slow enough to deny, fast enough to be unstoppable once the Nile ran out. The firm Daniel had built his career around lost its biggest client to a rival overnight, then a second, then a third, each departure triggering a chain reaction of layoffs that eventually reached his own office door. He remembered the exact weight of the box he carried out. A framed photo, a coffee mug, 7 years reduced to something he could hold in 2 arms. He told himself it was temporary, a setback, the kind of thing successful men recovered from with the right connections, the right next opportunity. His uncle stopped returning calls within a month. The golf invitations dried up first, then the casual check-ins, then eventually even the obligatory holiday texts that had once felt like nothing but now felt like everything. Daniel told himself his uncle was simply busy, that business demanded a certain distance, that it wasn't personal. He kept telling himself that even as the silence stretched into something undeniable. His sister needed her loan repaid suddenly, urgently, despite years of casual borrowing with no urgency attached to any of it. When Daniel explained he needed time, her voice turned cold in a way he'd never heard directed at him before. "This isn't really my problem," she said, and hung up before he could respond. His mother's calls grew shorter, then less frequent. each conversation laced with a discomfort she didn't bother hiding. She stopped introducing him at parties. She stopped mentioning him at all. He later learned, replacing his name in family conversations with vague, uncomfortable silence whenever someone asked how he was doing. Within 4 months, his savings were gone. Within 6, his apartment followed. He sat in his car outside a gas station one November night, engine running for warmth, and called his father, the last number he hadn't yet tried. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. No one called him back. Thanksgiving that year arrived without an invitation. Daniel noticed it the way you notice a missing tooth, a subtle absence his tongue kept returning to, worrying at the gap it left behind. Every year of his adult life, his mother's invitation had arrived like clockwork, a text 3 weeks out confirming what time to bring the wine. That year, November came and went in silence, and he told himself, again, that it must have been an oversight. He called to ask. His mother's voice carried an awkward brightness that didn't match her words. "Oh, we kept things small this year," she said. "Just close family." The sentence lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs. Close family. He turned the phrase over for days afterward, searching for a version of it that didn't mean what he suspected it meant. His sister's texts, once constant, thinned to occasional one-word replies, then nothing at all. When he finally reached her by phone, she sounded rushed, distracted, eager to end the call before it had properly begun. "Things are just busy right now," she said. Though busy, he noticed, hadn't stopped her from posting photos of a birthday dinner he hadn't been told about. His uncle's assistant began answering the office line instead of his uncle himself, always with the same polished apology, "He's in meetings all week. I'll pass along the message." The messages were never returned. Daniel remembered the version of himself who used to matter to these people, the golden nephew, the promising son, the man worth building plans around. He searched for that man in every unanswered call, every quiet exclusion, every excuse offered a half-second too quickly to be entirely true. He hadn't changed. He'd simply stopped being useful. And apparently, for his family, those had always been the same thing. By January, pride had become a luxury Daniel could no longer afford. He drove to his parents' house on a Tuesday afternoon, rehearsing the words the entire way, humiliation already burning in his chest, before he'd even parked in the driveway he'd once considered half his own. His mother answered the door with visible surprise, glancing behind her as though checking whether it was safe to let him fully into view. "I just need somewhere to stay," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "A few weeks, until I get back on my feet." His mother's eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward his father's study, before settling back on him with an expression he'd never seen her wear before. Not quite coldness, but something adjacent to it, something calculating. "Your father and I have talked about this," she said carefully. "We think it's important you learn to handle your own situation. We raised you to be independent." Independent. As if independence had been the goal all along, rather than the convenient explanation for abandonment. He tried his uncle next, standing in the man's office lobby for 40 minutes before finally being granted 5. His uncle didn't offer him a seat. "I can't be seen bankrolling a bad situation," his uncle said, checking his watch twice during the conversation. "It's not personal, Daniel. It's just business." Dan Gust. Approve first behavior. It's just business, as though family had ever been anything else to these people. His sister was the cruelest, though she likely didn't intend it that way, or perhaps she did and simply lacked the self-awareness to notice. "Maybe this is a wake-up call," she said over the phone, her voice bright with a sympathy that didn't reach her words. "Sometimes people need to hit bottom to really grow." He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to people who had already decided his worth had expired. That night, sitting alone in a motel room paid for with his last $100, Daniel made a decision that would define the next 7 years of his life. He would never ask them for anything again. And one day, he promised himself, he wouldn't need to. Word travels fast in families that talk more than they love. Daniel learned, secondhand and months later, that his failure had become something of a cautionary tale at family gatherings he was no longer invited to. A cousin mentioned it first, awkwardly, over a text meant to check in but landing instead like an accidental confession. Aunt Carol mentioned what happened at Thanksgiving. "Sorry man, that's rough." He hadn't known there was a version of events being told at all, let alone one that made him the subject of pity dressed up as gossip. He pieced together the rest slowly. His mother had taken to describing his situation to friends as a difficult phase, her tone suggesting weakness rather than misfortune, personal failing rather than circumstance. His uncle, at a business dinner Daniel later heard about through a former colleague, had reportedly laughed off a question about his nephew with a dismissive comment about some people simply not being built for real pressure. His sister stopped acknowledging him publicly altogether. A mutual friend mentioned running into her at a restaurant, mentioning Daniel's name only to watch her visibly stiffen and change the subject, as though he were an embarrassment better left unmentioned in polite company. The final blow arrived quietly, almost anticlimactically. His name disappeared from the family group chat. No announcement, no explanation, simply an absence he noticed only when a cousin's wedding was planned entirely without his knowledge, discovered later through a photo posted online, his entire family smiling together in a frame that no longer included him. He sat with that photo longer than he should have, studying the easy warmth on their faces, the effortless belonging he'd once taken for granted. They hadn't just stopped helping him. They had erased him, quietly and completely, the way you might erase a debt you never intended to repay. He was, for the first time in his life, entirely alone. The shelter smelled like bleach, and something underneath the bleach that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. Bodies, exhaustion, the particular staleness of spaces where too many broken plans converged in one room. Daniel learned the sound of it before anything else, the coughing at 3 a.m. The coughing at 3 a.m. The shuffle of donated shoes across linoleum, the low murmur of men who had stopped expecting good news from anyone. He learned to sleep lightly, one hand near the bag that held everything he still owned. A change of clothes, an expired ID, a phone with a cracked screen he kept charged only for job applications that rarely answered back. Winter made everything sharper. He remembered standing in a soup kitchen line on a morning so cold his breath hung visible in front of him, watching steam rise off styrofoam cups clutched by hands that shook from more than just temperature. He remembered the particular humiliation of using a food bank for the first time. The volunteers kind. Practiced smile that somehow made the moment worse rather than better. Pity dressed up as compassion. He took whatever work existed, loading trucks before sunrise, washing dishes until his hands cracked and bled in the dry winter air, standing on street corners handing out flyers for businesses that paid barely enough to matter. He learned which library branches allowed the longest stays, which ones had outlets near the back where he could charge his phone undisturbed, which coffee shops wouldn't ask him to leave for nursing a single cup for 3 hours while filling out applications. There were nights he questioned whether persistence was courage or simply an inability to accept defeat. There were nights he thought of calling his mother, his sister, his uncle, and stopped himself only by remembering the exact tone of their refusals, sharp enough to cut through even the coldest nights. He had nothing left to lose, which meant, in some strange and terrible way, he finally had nothing left to fear either. That realization, more than anything, was where the climb began. The turning point arrived without fanfare, the way most real turning points do, not as a lightning bolt of clarity, but as a small, unremarkable moment that only revealed its significance in hindsight. Daniel was washing dishes at a diner on the edge of downtown, when Frank, the owner, a weathered man in his 60s who'd built the place from nothing decades earlier, caught him sketching numbers on a napkin during his break, a rough outline for a delivery logistics system that could save small restaurants like Frank's thousands in wasted inventory. Frank had picked up the napkin, studied it longer than Daniel expected, and asked a single question that changed everything. "Why are you washing my dishes instead of building this?" Daniel had laughed, bitter and reflexive. "Building things takes money I don't have, connections I used to have." "Used to," Frank repeated, handing the napkin back. "That's the past tense talking. What about now?" Frank didn't offer him money. He offered something more valuable, an old laptop gathering dust in his storage room, 2 hours of quiet counter space each morning before the diner opened, and blunt, unglamorous advice from a man who'd rebuilt his own life twice before Daniel was even born. It wasn't generosity that moved Daniel most. It was the absence of pity in it. Frank treated him like a man with potential, not a man who needed rescuing, and the distinction mattered more than Daniel expected. He began coding again in the early mornings, the diner silent except for the hum of refrigerators and Frank's radio playing low in the kitchen. He researched logistics software late into the library's closing hours, rebuilding knowledge he'd once taken for granted, piece by piece, with the specific hunger of a man who finally understood what it meant to lose everything. For the first time in over a year, Daniel felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the exhaustion. Not hope exactly, something steadier. Purpose. The first version of the software failed within 3 weeks. Crashing under the weight of features Daniel hadn't yet learned to code properly. He rebuilt it in his second month at the diner, then rebuilt it again in his fourth, each failure teaching him something the last one hadn't. Frank never once suggested he give up, though he never softened his opinions either, offering criticism with the same bluntness he applied to every burnt batch of hash browns in his kitchen. Daniel took a part-time coding course at the community college, paying for it in installments scraped together from diner shifts and a second job stocking shelves overnight. He slept less than he ate, and he ate less than he should have, but something in him had shifted permanently since the night in his car outside the gas station. He no longer measured success by other people's approval. He measured it by whether he'd done more today than yesterday. The first client came 8 months in, a small family, owned bakery willing to test his delivery system in exchange for free service, more favor than contract. It worked, barely, held together by long nights and constant patches. But it worked, and word spread slowly through Frank's network of small business owners who trusted him enough to take a chance on the quiet, determined man who used to wash their neighbors' dishes. By the second year, Daniel had 6 paying clients and enough saved to rent a small office above a laundromat, the first space that had ever belonged entirely to him. By the third year, a logistics company noticed his software's efficiency ratings and offered to license it, a deal that finally gave him room to breathe for the first time since the collapse. He didn't call his family to share the news. He didn't call anyone, really, except Frank, who received the update with a satisfied nod and an insistence that the celebration dinner was on Daniel this time. Every dollar he earned after that felt different from the ones he'd lost. Heavier somehow, weighted with the memory of exactly what it had cost to rebuild them from nothing. He had done this alone. He intended to remember that. By the 5th year, the small logistics software Daniel had first sketched on a diner napkin had become something no one, least of all him, could have predicted. What began as a favor for a struggling bakery had grown into a platform used by hundreds of small businesses across 3 states, streamlining deliveries in a way larger competitors hadn't bothered to consider. A regional business journal ran a profile on him, calling him the quiet architect behind the small business supply revolution, a headline he read 3 times in his office before allowing himself to actually believe it. The acquisition offer came in his 6th year, a number large enough that he'd asked the lawyer to repeat it twice, certain he'd misheard the zeros. He didn't sell the entire company, keeping a controlling stake and a seat on the board, but the deal alone changed the shape of his life permanently. He bought a house not for its size, though it was substantial, but for the quiet, unshakable stability it represented. Proof, tangible and real, that the man who'd once slept in his car had built something no one could take from him again. He hired Frank's grandson for his first job out of college, a quiet nod to the man who'd handed him an old laptop and 2 hours of counter space when no one else in his life had offered anything at all. He funded a small scholarship at the community college where he'd taken his first coding class, specifically for students working full-time jobs while studying, students who understood exhaustion the way he once had. Success, when it finally arrived, felt less like triumph and more like exhale, a long overdue release of tension he'd carried so constantly he'd almost forgotten what its absence felt like. He didn't publicize his story at first. He didn't need to. But success has its own gravity, and slowly, inevitably, word began to travel back through the same channels that had once carried news of his failure. Mutual acquaintances, old neighbors, a cousin who still followed him on social media, despite years of silence between them. He knew, with the particular clarity of a man who understood exactly how his family operated, that it was only a matter of time before the silence broke. He wasn't wrong. The first message arrived from his sister 6 years and 4 months after she told him to treat his collapse as a wake-up call. It was brief, warm, utterly unbothered by the years between them, as though no time had passed at all, as though nothing had ever needed repairing. "Hey, stranger," saw the article. "So proud of you. We should catch up soon." Daniel read it twice, then set the phone down without responding. He knew, better than anyone, exactly what catching up would mean to people who had only ever valued him for what he could offer them. He simply hadn't decided yet whether he was willing to offer it again. The messages multiplied faster than Daniel expected, each one arriving with the same practiced warmth, the same conspicuous absence of apology. His uncle called first. A voicemail left on a Tuesday afternoon that opened with a hearty laugh, as though 7 years of silence were simply a long joke they'd both been in on together. "Daniel, your uncle here, heard incredible things. Absolutely incredible. We should really get lunch, catch up properly. Family should stay close, you know? Family should stay close." The phrase landed with a bitterness Daniel hadn't expected, considering how easily his uncle had once discarded that same principle over 5 uninterrupted minutes in a lobby. His mother's approach was softer, more emotional, calibrated for maximum effect. She called twice, then sent a long message about how proud she'd always been of him, how she'd known deep down he had it in him, how families go through rough patches but blood always finds its way back together. She made no mention of the Thanksgiving without an invitation. She made no mention of the words close family used to specifically exclude him. His sister posted about him online before she'd even spoken to him directly. A photo from years earlier, some forgotten holiday, captioned with pride she hadn't felt the day she called his collapse a wake-up call. The comments filled with congratulations from relatives who'd forgotten he existed for the better part of a decade, all of them suddenly eager to claim proximity to a success they'd contributed nothing toward. Daniel watched it unfold with a strange, detached clarity, understanding exactly what was happening beneath the surface warmth. This wasn't reconciliation. It was repositioning. His family hadn't rediscovered love for him. They'd simply recalculated his value, and the number, this time, was one they didn't want to miss out on. The knock on his door, when it finally came, surprised him least of all. He let them in. Eventually, though not out of forgiveness, out of curiosity, a clinical desire to see exactly how far they were willing to bend the truth to fit their comfort. His mother spoke first, settling onto his couch as though she'd earned the right to its cushions, her eyes sweeping the house with an appraisal she didn't bother to hide. "We're so proud of you," she said, reaching for his hand before he could withdraw it. "I always knew you'd land on your feet. You get that resilience from your father's side." Daniel said nothing, letting the silence stretch long enough to become uncomfortable. His uncle filled it, predictably, with business talk disguised as pride. "You know, I always saw potential in you, told people at the club you'd surprise everyone eventually. This could be good for both of us, actually. I've got some connections that could take this to the next level. Both of us." Daniel almost laughed. Even now, even here, his uncle couldn't manage affection without attaching a transaction to it. His sister's approach was different, softer, more calculated toward guilt rather than opportunity. "I know things were hard for a while," she said, her voice trembling with what might have been genuine emotion or might have simply been well-rehearsed. "I think about that call sometimes. I was going through my own stuff too, you know. We all were." We all were. As though her own comfort during his collapse constituted suffering equivalent to his. He let them talk. The apologies that weren't quite apologies, the excuses dressed up as context, the careful avoidance of specific memories that would have made their current affection impossible to maintain with a straight face. He watched his mother avoid any mention of the word independent. He watched his uncle avoid any mention of just business. He watched his sister avoid any mention of wake-up call entirely. They remembered everything, he realized. They simply hoped he'd remember less. When the room finally quieted, waiting for his response, Daniel set down his coffee cup with deliberate calm. "You all left when I had nothing," he said. "Now I'm supposed to believe you're here for something other than what I have now." No one answered, because there was no answer that wouldn't confirm exactly what he already knew. Daniel stood, not out of anger, but because sitting suddenly felt like agreeing to a conversation he no longer wanted to have on their terms. "Let me tell you what I remember," he said, and something in his voice made even his uncle stop reaching for his coffee. "I remember standing in your lobby for 40 minutes, Uncle Richard, waiting for 5 minutes of your time. You didn't offer me a seat. You checked your watch twice. You told me it wasn't personal. It was just business." It was just business. His uncle's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I remember calling you," Daniel continued, turning to his mother, "and asking for a few weeks. Just a few weeks in the house I grew up in. You told me you and Dad wanted me to learn independence. You used that word like it was a gift you were giving me, instead of a door you were closing in my face." His mother's eyes filled, but Daniel had learned over 7 hard years to distinguish real remorse from the performance of it. This felt like the latter, tears summoned for effect rather than earned through reflection. "And you," he said to his sister, his voice softening only slightly, "told me I needed a wake-up call, that hitting bottom would help me grow. I want you to know I thought about that phrase every single night I slept in a shelter, every single morning I stood in a food bank line. I hope it comforts you to know your advice worked. I did grow, just not with any of your help." The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that only exists when people finally run out of angles to defend themselves from. "I'm not angry anymore," Daniel said, and he realized, saying it aloud, that it was true. "Anger would mean I still needed something from you. I don't. I built a life without any of you, brick by brick, with nothing but stubbornness and a diner owner who believed in me more than my own family ever did." He walked to the door and opened it, the late afternoon light spilling across the floor between them. "You didn't come back because you missed me," he said quietly. "You came back because you finally noticed what you threw away. Those aren't the same thing, and I'm not confused about the difference anymore." No one moved for a long moment. Then, one by one, they did. The house was quiet again after they left, but it was a different quiet than the one that had followed him through the shelter, through the diner's early mornings, through years of building something out of nothing. This silence felt earned, chosen, his. He called Frank that evening, the way he did most Sundays now, a habit that had replaced the family dinners he'd once treated as sacred and unquestionable. Frank answered on the second ring, his voice gruff and familiar, already asking whether Daniel had eaten dinner yet, whether he was working himself too hard, the particular gentle nagging of a man who'd become more of a father than blood ever had. "They came by today," Daniel said. "And," Frank asked, no judgment in the question, only curiosity. "And I told them the truth." Frank was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Daniel considered the question honestly, turning it over the way Frank had taught him to turn over problems that mattered. "Lighter," he finally said, "like I finally closed a door I'd been holding open out of habit, not hope." He spent that weekend the way he spent most of them now. Dinner with Frank's family, a phone call with the coding professor who'd once waived his course fees when money ran short, a quiet afternoon mentoring a student at the community college who reminded him, more than he cared to admit, of himself 7 years earlier. These were the people who had built his life alongside him, not the ones who'd arrived only after the building was finished. He didn't need his family's pride anymore. He had something steadier now, something they could never touch or claim credit for. He had peace. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, that was more than enough. Both scripts are complete. Ready for the next one whenever you are.